You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. On today's programme, scientists say they've created the whitest ever paint, which could help cool buildings and tackle the climate crisis. More smiles than substance? We've got the latest from Brussels on a virtual meeting between the Chinese, French and German leaders all about climate change. And saving the octopus teacher kelp forests, one of the world's richest ecosystems. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and meet those coming up with the solutions. And we aim to take you to the heart of the climate crisis, explain the data driving the changes that are already affecting us, but also show you just how far we've come. Coming up, more on what we learned from today's meeting between leaders from China, France and Germany on climate issues. But first, scientists have developed what they claim is the whitest ever paint as a way of tackling global warming. Engineers at Purdue University in Indiana say it could be used on the roofs of buildings as a way of cooling them, reducing the need for air conditioning. Well, in a moment, I'll be speaking to one of the professors behind it. But first, here's why it's important and how it could make a difference.
It is better than current white paint because it's reflecting a lot more than conventional white paint does. And as a result of it reflecting a lot more, a lot less heat is entering the building, and therefore the demand for cooling that building is significantly reduced. When white paint was put on the top of this hospital, the patients who suffered from extreme heat, particularly on the top floor of that hospital, were dramatically benefited. So some studies recommend that using smart surfaces across cities can reduce their global warming impact by 10 to 15% and reduce temperatures by about 5 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century.
Well, joining me now from Indiana is Professor Shulin Ruan, one of the engineers who developed the paint. Welcome to you. So how can an ultra-white paint help tackle global warming?
So the commercial paint available on the market today, they only reflect 80 to 90% of sunlight, which means they absorb 10 to 20% sunlight. So different in our paint, we reflect as high as 98.1% of sunlight back to the space. So it only absorbs 1.9% of sunlight. That's kind of cutting the absorption of heat from the sun by 5 to 10 times. So, that kind of really helps stop the warming trend of the Earth.
And so how much whiter is this paint than the current whitish shade, and how much difference do you think that will actually make?
Our paint is, looks much whiter than the other commercial white paints available. Now, compared to the commercial paint that reflects to about 80%, if you cover our paint on a house with 100 square meter floor size, it can help reduce almost 20 kilowatt of the heating from the sun. So that's really a big deal. In some areas, using our paint on the roof can even totally remove the need to turn on their air conditioner.
How widely would you expect modern buildings to use this? How widely used could it be?
Actually, we already got a lot of inquiries from the hot climates over the world, such as India, Middle East, Africa, South America, Central America, and then south part of the United States. People already painting their houses with white. But again, our white is much whiter than those they can purchase. So hopefully, our paint can be available, a year or two, so people can use it.
Now let's take a look at some of the day's other climate news now. And scientists are warning that coral reefs around Hawaii could be destroyed by heavy flooding. When storms occur, sediment is washed into the ocean and onto the reefs. It blocks sunlight from hitting the reefs, making it harder for the coral to get nutrients through photosynthesis. Hawaii's state climatologist says extreme rainfall will become more common on the islands as a result of global warming. A new hybrid of bear has been discovered, which could be more resilient to climate change. Grizzly bears have been mating with endangered polar bears to create the so-called Pizzly bear, which experts say is better adapted to warm weather. Grizzly bears in Alaska and Canada have been migrating north as temperatures increase, bringing them into close contact with polar bears. And winemakers in France are hitting the bottle after a difficult start to the growing season. It's estimated at least a third of French wines, worth almost €2 billion in sales, will be lost this year due to unseasonably cold temperatures in spring. Government ministers say the extreme weather is the result of climate change. Now, it's been a big week in climate diplomacy, so let's remind you of what's been going on. And US climate envoy John Kerry has arrived in South Korea after several days of talks with officials in China. Meanwhile, China's President Xi Jinping has taken part in a virtual climate change meeting with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the French President Emmanuel Macron. Well, later today, President Biden will host Japan's Prime Minister at the White House, with issues on climate change thought to be high on the agenda. And the US president has invited world leaders to a virtual Earth Day summit next Thursday. Russia and China have both yet to confirm if they're going to attend. Well, there were some positive messages today following that meeting between Chinese, French and German leaders. So joining me now from Brussels is our correspondent Michelle Clifford. So Michelle, what did we learn from this meeting today?
Well, it was certainly very important to get the Chinese president on board. China is the world's biggest polluter in terms of CO2 emissions. So Angela Merkel and President Macron were very pleased to have President Xi in the conversation. What we're being told is that he reaffirmed China's goal of CO2 neutrality by 2060. That's a big deal in terms of a commitment. And he also decided to sign up to what's known as the Montreal Protocol Kigali Amendment to strengthen control of greenhouse gases. And the French and the Germans said that they were very pleased about that indeed. So President Xi committed to working further with Germany and France and other EU nations in terms of issues of climate change. And of course, the EU at the moment has made very ambitious climate goals of its own, committing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 and aiming for climate neutrality by 2050, Anna.
Thanks, Michelle. The BAFTA award-winning Netflix documentary, My Octopus Teacher, has become a cult hit, taking viewers into a world few have ever seen. It focuses on filmmaker Craig Foster and the wild octopus he follows for most of her life. It's filmed in a kelp forest off the coast of Cape Town in South Africa, and now a campaign has been launched to preserve the underwater ecosystem that's under threat as the world's oceans warm. Well, earlier, I spoke to Pippa Ehrlich, who directed the documentary, and started by asking her about the importance of kelp forests.
Kelp forests are important because they are very important carbon sequesters. They provide habitat to a very, very rich level of biodiversity, an incredible community of species. They're also very productive ecosystems. And another thing that we're realizing, especially in the age of rising sea levels, is that kelp forests protect our coastlines from storms and swells, but they're very vulnerable. The IPCC report, which came out a couple of years ago, listed kelp forests as the second most vulnerable ecosystems, marine ecosystems, to climate change. And they're just beautiful, magical places. You go underwater in that kelp forest, and it feels like you're in a wonderland.
And you put this extraordinary relationship between Craig Foster and the octopus at the heart of your film. It's quite an emotional relationship. Was that a deliberate decision?
As soon as we saw the footage and we heard how Craig described his experience, the nature of the story is that it's an emotional one. It wasn't really deliberate. It was just the story that we had in front of us. And we were really lucky to have something that, you know, could move people.
How do you move on from such an intense experience like that?
Being able to work on a film like this and with a story like this is truly a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I work with the Sea Change Project, which is the organization that Craig co-founded almost 10 years ago. And what we're trying to do is raise awareness around kelp forests all over the world, and specifically protect the Great African Sea Forest, which is the kelp forest where the octopus lived. And we have a lot of work to do. And we're starting with a big local screening campaign later this year, and we've got a lot of other exciting projects in the works. The day after the film launched, we were getting an email every 3 seconds, and that went on for weeks. We've received emails from psychologists telling us that they're recommending their film to their clients. We've received emails from young marine biologists who, were really disillusioned in the time of COVID about the careers that they were starting out in, and have decided to carry on because they found the film inspiring. So as a filmmaker and a storyteller, to get that kind of reaction to your work is the most fulfilling thing that can happen.
The Philippines is one of the countries most at risk from the climate crisis because of sea level rises, extreme weather events, rising temperatures and severe rainfall. In the latest of our series of climate diaries, youth activist Mitzi Janelle Tan tells us how her personal experiences of the climate emergency led to her campaigning to raise awareness of climate issues, both in the Philippines and around the world.
I grew up seeing the impacts of climate change firsthand. Having to be afraid of drowning in my own bedroom, and sometimes waking up in the middle of the night with floodwater in my room and having to scoop it out, cold and dark and afraid. Growing up, I would go to strangers and talk to them about greenhouse gas emissions and global warming and the ozone layer. Because climate education in the Philippines is so lacking, I didn't even make the connection between the typhoons that I was already experiencing and the greenhouse gas emissions that I was talking about. We needed an organization that specifically talked about the climate. And so me and my friends, we decided to put up Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines. I realized that I have no choice. I have to join the struggle of our environmental defenders and of the people for a better planet, a better future, a safe present. I had to join the fight.
That's it for today's show, but you can get your climate fix over the weekend with our podcast. On this week's episode, find out how a little golden toad led to the world's most important climate treaty. That's on ClimateCast, and you can find it wherever you normally get your podcasts from. And of course, you can watch our weekly digital show with Ali Fortescue on Sky News social channels, our app and website. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.